The Unlit Button. He had a habit of watching the floor numbers even though he knew them by heart. The elevator's panel was old and green, a chlorinated glow in a bronze frame that made every trip feel like the end of some small ceremony. The heavy button press, the impatient shrug at floor 3 when it paused for no good reason, the drift to 7, the gentle sway as the car chose where to stop. A week could be measured by how many times he watched the little numbers climb, by how many mornings he made the mistake of trying to time the door before it opened. David's routines lived in narrow grooves. He folded his bath towel the same way every evening, into thirds, then in half, the edge aligned so the stripes matched up, and hung it on the rod so the bottom brushed the tiles by exactly an inch. His coffee mug, a chipped one with a blue rim and a hairline crack that had never worsened, took up a permanent place on the counter. When he washed it, he set it on the rack upside down, an old paper receipt beneath it to catch the drip rings, because the drying mat always seemed to keep a damp memory that bothered him. In the evenings, after the 7-minute walk home from the bus stop, he'd stand at his kitchen window and look at the traffic light on Harran and Morey, counting the red, the yellow and the green. Because counting made the day gather into something he could pick up and store somewhere. He lived in the Larch Street Apartments, a red brick block from the 1960s that tried to look newer, with a blue awning and a glossy placard that said, "Elevator modernized for your comfort," as if a flaw UD always had been added, as if the old has been corrected. The lobby was pea green and smelled like wet coats 9 months of the year. The super tape notices to the wall with unconvincing tape, boiler maintenance Tuesday morning, recycling bins moving to the rear entrance, please, no bicycles in the hall. The fluorescent fixtures hummed and sometimes stuttered, as if practicing a hiccup. On the morning of the first snow, before the city decided whether winter would be serious, he stood by the window of his 7th-floor apartment and watched a handful of fat flakes fall. The buildings across the street blurred and then sharpened again. His coffee was the same cheap stuff he always bought at the corner store, the same metallic sweet-sour smell that reminded him of his father's thermos on road trips. He took a sip and winced at the heat, then smiled because it was right that it should be too hot. The mug left a circle on the receipt. He lifted the mug, shifted the scrap of paper, pressed the damp ring flat with his thumb, and went to the door with his scarf and keys. He checked the towel in the bathroom. Aligned. He jiggled the refrigerator door and listened for the gentle pull of the seal. The compressor clicked on, the low hum establishing itself across the kitchen like a body settling into a couch. He waited a second longer than necessary to hear it, then left. The elevator was empty. He pressed 1 with his knuckle out of the habit he developed during the spring. Everyone had been told to stop touching things, and never stopped. The door closed with a soft sigh. The little green numbers counted down, 7, 6, 5. He shifted his bag to the other shoulder. 4. He tugged his cuff down over his wrist. 3. The car shifted as if deciding the weight of the day. 2. There was a faint odor, metal warmed by hands, faintly wet wool, and beneath it a smell he didn't place right away, damp earth like a basement that breathed through its own cracks. The elevator stopped. The doors slid open. He stepped into the lobby, tugging on his gloves, and walked out into the white that wasn't white anymore. Bus to work measured the day in phone calls and sendbacks, and a late lunch eaten in front of his screen, and forgot about the damp smell by the time he reached the bus home. The wind had picked up. He tightened his scarf and counted the red, yellow, green, while the snow ticked against the window. The elevator ride, coming back, was a familiar little climb. He pressed 7, watched 1 go to 2, 3, 4. The slight hesitation before 5 in case someone with groceries had misjudged their timing. No one got on. The car took him through 6. The little green 7 lit up, a comfort, then went out as the car shivered and kept going. He blinked and frowned and lifted his hand halfway to the panel, as if that would help. The elevator did not stop. An unlit button he had never seen before, lower than the row of normal buttons, a lonely orphan in the brass, gave a soft, unseen answer, its ring faintly aglow, as though the power had found it for the first time in years, and politely revised it. The car stopped. The door opened onto darkness. It wasn't a dramatic black, not the kind television gives you when they want to pretend equipment is brave. It was a thick dark, a dark you could tell had never learned to be a hallway. The air smelled wrong. He placed it then, damp soil, sour with a hint of stone dust. The floor beyond the door was not carpet, not tile. It was dirt, tamped and then scuffed, the way a path grows by insistence. To his left, his building's walls did not continue. The walls he saw looked handmade by someone who thought walls were more idea than duty. Half brick, half crumbled mortar, a section of crumbling plaster with a faint shadow where something had once hung. A number had been scratched into the plaster with a nail or a key or a stubborn coin. The number was 8, not a printed 8 or a painted one, the figure of an 8 carved in with impatience. He stared at it. No, he told himself, that is a figure that looks like 8. It's 2 loops, one on top of the other. It is a crude infinity. It is something. He reached his hand to the door close button and pressed with his knuckle as if his knuckle could earn him a favor. The doors slid toward one another as though pushing a spoon into hard-packed sand. They were very slow. A noise came from down the hallway, a sound with weight, not feet, a drag, a slow, deliberate scraping against dirt, then a pause. Something breathing that didn't need air. He wasn't sure where the thought came from, only that it landed and sat there. He held the button down, lip of his glove pressed to the brass, and breath took up residence in his mouth like a homeless thing. The doors kept moving very politely. A pale shape detached from the dark, long and wrong. A hand, perhaps a hand, the fingers too long, joints a memory of joints, pushing between the doors as if the machinery were nothing more than a stubborn curtain. He saw the suggestion of a wrist like the neck of a bird. The doors met the obstruction and the motor whined, trying to pretend it meant to open all along. The pressure in his chest went literal. The hand held. The doors parted again with the patient choreography of duty. He pressed 1 in the way you press when you believe pressing harder is helpful. The button made its little pointless click with the politeness of a bell at someone else's front desk. He did not realize he was saying no, no under his breath until the word told him to stop saying it. The doors opened again, and very calmly and very slowly, he raised his other hand and hit the emergency stop switch, and then pulled it up again, because somewhere sometime a person in a navy blazer had told him not to hold those down, and he still had that person's voice in his head. The hand slipped back as if the darkness had changed its mind. The doors began to close. He did not want to see what the darkness would do if he asked it to be reasonable again. The doors closed, and he closed his eyes and tried not to hear any sound. There was no sound. The little car took its breath, the motors full of their strains and sighs, and began to move. The elevator stopped at 7. The doors opened. The hallway was his hallway again, beige carpet with a thread pulled loose near the fire extinguisher. 2 picture frames of bleached seashells the management believed tenants wanted to look at. The smell of hot dust and fabric softener and someone's turmeric simmering from an apartment where people spoke with their music when they were happy. He stepped out and did not look at the panel to see if the new button was real, because it couldn't be. His key worked in his lock. He went in. He set his bag down and hung his scarf on the back of the chair where he always hung it. He went to the sink and ran the tap for a second, let the water clear. The refrigerator clicked on, and he listened to it hungrily. The relief, the hum, gave him a ridiculous fullness he tried not to punish himself for. He filled his glass with water and drank it all, and set the glass down and realized his hands were shaking. He pulled the towel on the oven handle straight. It wasn't crooked. He poured more water. The glass left a ring on the counter, and he moved it to a dry spot, then moved it again because the ring had made something obvious about the world. He did not sit. He wandered from window to window, looked at the traffic light, counted red, yellow, green, and kept losing count because the intersections in the building of his head had been temporarily diverted. It was only when he went into the bathroom and saw the mirror that he realized how pallid he had gotten. His lips had the color of undone laundry. His eyes were reflecting too much light, the way eyes do when a person is sick and doesn't know it yet. He touched his tongue with his index finger. It felt like he'd licked an old battery. He frowned at his finger. It was clean. He washed his hands, washed the thought off, and dried with the towel he'd straightened moments before. He set himself down upon his couch, then stood again, small, useless movements that pretend to make the body believe. The refrigerator hummed faithfully. He listened to its low, white noise until it put a little normal back into him. Then he turned on the small radio on the kitchen windowsill, the one with the dial that never quite lands on the right notch, and let a voice talk about a team he didn't care about, because a voice talking about something so resolutely unimportant was like walking along a curb and remembering the ground would catch him if he fell. The hallway smelled normal when he cracked his door 3 hours later and peered out. The elevator at the far end sat with its door closed, blank and proper. He considered the stairs, but the sign taped to the stairwell door said, "Temporary closure, mopping in progress, thank you." And he couldn't bring himself to defy the stiff paper. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button. The plastic ring came to life, a mild orange. He glanced at the panel as the car arrived and thought that would be either the end of his nonsense or the beginning of something he had no name for. The panel had the new button. It lay below the others, alone in a row of polished brass. The others were a flat green when pressed and green in their rest. This one was dark, then brighter at the edges, the glow coming from a little ring under the plate, as if it had been asleep, and now had decided to ride along whether he wanted it or not. 8 was etched on it, not printed, a thin 8, the loop slightly tilted as though whoever made it had been keeping one eye on him while they worked. He felt his chest go clumsy. He did not press it. He pressed 1, and he went outside and he walked to the corner store. Because that is what you do when nothing makes sense. You put your body in a place that can count money. The corner store lit him with a forgiving light. The barcode scanner chirped with a nest of birds. Connie, behind the counter, tore paper towel from a roll with the tenderness some people reserve for silk and wiped down the counter in little circles between every person like she could make the day agree. He bought milk and eggs and cereal he ate like medicine. The receipt printed, the ink a faint burn, the paper warm when it landed in his fingertips. He folded it, laid it under his mug, went home. The elevator brought him to 7 like a good machine. When he opened the door to his apartment, the refrigerator hummed on cue, and when he made himself crawl under the covers, the hum stayed steady. He didn't sleep over much. He slept like a person guarding a door. He got up once at 1:57 and once at 3:12 and stood in his kitchen listening to the building talk to itself, the groans in the pipes, the far sirens moving east, the flit of the stairwell light as it came on for someone who had an early shift. At 4:40, he made toast and ate it standing up, the butter softening in a pale, glossy square that made him think of school cafeterias. At 5:30, he showered, careful not to get water on the floor, even though the super had put down a strip of caulk at the base of the tub, even though his own care had become the only tenable loyalty he possessed. He dried himself with the towel, folded it, hung it, checked the edge, checked again. The second morning, he prepared himself like an actor stepping on stage. The hallway was as it had always been, and yet something had rerouted. He pressed the elevator button. The ring lit. The doors opened. He stepped in. He pressed 1 with his knuckle. He watched 7 go to 6, to 5, to 4. He held his breath at 3. He found himself pressing his thumb to the side of the car, feeling the vibration in the panelled wall, as if the car could be asked to attend to the human need for bargaining. At 2, it came. Faint, like a wrong note in a song you've tried to teach your mouth for years. A hum slightly lower than yesterday. A motor trying to please someone not quite in the room. The car nudged through 1, didn't stop. He made a sound he couldn't identify. The 8 lit up slowly. The elevator paused like a person retying a shoe because they have to, not because they want to. And then it stopped. The doors opened onto the dirt again. The air came in and touched him like a hand that had been underwater. Something far down the hall made a breath and withdrew. He pressed door close. He pressed it again. Door close is a button that has to be convinced of your sincerity on the best of days. On this day, it decided to interview him. The doors inched and came together in a resolute whisper. He did not look to see if a hand came through. He breathed something halfway between prayer and apology. The panel gave him 1 because it was ashamed of itself. He stepped into the lobby as if he had been given a reprieve. He walked through the green and damp smell and said good morning to the woman with the yoga mat because he had never said good morning to her, and this day required formalities. She smiled the careful smile of people who have only their bodies to barter. He went to work. He counted the red, yellow, green at the same corner as always. He ate lunch in the lounge and avoided the stainless vending machine because the bright light inside it made him feel like meat. He stopped by the Building S bulletin board and took a picture of the winter trash schedule because schedules mean something when the world is being kind. He avoided looking at the elevator when he came home. He took the stairs, even though the sign said no, and even though the light on the middle landing was broken and made the darkness there a person. The light had always flickered when damp outside, but this flicker was a bass note. He counted his breaths as he climbed. On 2, on 3, on 4. His breath wasn't entirely his. It had a metallic edge, like the taste of a 10-cent coin you keep in your mouth because you are sick of being told your hand is dirty. He didn't stop by his window. He went to the sink and ran the water and waited for the brown to clear because coming up the stairwell always dislodged something in the pipes. The refrigerator clicked on, but later than usual. He stood in the silence that wasn't silence, not with traffic behaving with its distant sullen, not with the building's own voice, and willed the click to come. When it did, he turned and smiled, without anyone there to see him, and whispered, "Thank you," embarrassed by his own voice, as if he'd caught himself singing. He made dinner, pasta with the cheap tomato sauce he pretended could taste sly if he added pepper. And when he set his mug down on the counter after, the ring it made on the receipt had that texture of a thing beginning to curl. He pressed the receipt's corner flat. He wiped the counter with the dishcloth and then straightened the towel because it seemed a little off. He told himself he would not check the elevator. He checked the elevator. It was a normal elevator, sitting in a normal door, in a normal hall. And how dare he act like a person who cannot understand a simple mistake in the shivering of a motor. On the 3rd morning, the little screen counted down and the car stopped at 1. The lobby was its own warm smell. He laughed out loud at the fake potted plant near the front door because it was so unconvincing and so earnest in its wanting to be a tree. He went outside and slipped once on the grit and caught himself on the handrail and left a handprint like a man arrested. On the bus, a kid scanned his card and nothing beeped. The bus driver waved him past because no beep that day meant you could be kinder until someone told you not to be. The traffic lights at Harran and Morey stayed green a little longer than they should have once and then moved on. People breathed and breathed again. It would have been possible to say that the thing had been a motor fault, a relay sticking, a twitched signal, if it hadn't been for the 4th day. There was snow, a real kind this time, the clean white kind that brightens sidewalks and covers sins in a pausing layer. He pressed 1. The car moved. The hum dropped again, as if the elevator had a cold. The numbers slipped through 5 and 4. At 3, it stuttered very slightly, like a person recovering their composure after a not terrible joke. At 1, the car eased, then abruptly continued, like someone squeezed the button of a remote with greasy fingers and then apologized. The 8 lit. The door opened. It was the same hall. It had waited. He truly believed that. He stared down the dark. He took the smallest step forward, the sort of step you take when you'd like to test air without actually entering it, and realized he could hear something. It wasn't the scrape this time. It was a long exhale, a study in what it means to wait. Without realizing he was doing it, he turned his head and looked to his right at the brass panel. His hand reached out and pressed door close, like a marionette working out its autonomy. The car hesitated. He pressed the button again. The doors began their obstinate glide. He could feel that he was being watched. It wasn't that the hall had a presence. The presence was the absence, space occupied by a decision that wasn't his. The doors closed. The car had mercy. It delivered him to the lobby and then to the street. He stood under the awning for a long breath and decided outrage would make him dumb, and dumb men fall down. He clamped his mouth around his breath and went to the bus and let the bus have him. At his desk, he printed a shipping label. On the corner, the printer whispered through its fuser, the way heating elements purr when asked to be held together. He applied the label straight the way a person who cares about small things cares about middles. He ate a sandwich that tasted like salt and something else. Not the tomato, but an aftertaste like he de-sniffed a radiator. No one had to tell anyone anything. The day moved. The rest of the week was made of small changes. The towel did not hang wrong, not quite, but he felt like it would if he didn't fix it. A light bulb over the stove began to hum, a pitch he could hum back because it wove itself into him. The refrigerator continued to click on, but the click had a footnote, as if it had taken to clearing its throat. The elevator on morning 5 did not stop at 8, but it lit the 8 button for 1 second, as if casting a vote in a meeting no one had called. On morning 6, notices appeared in the lobby, new paper taped to old. Elevator inspection. Friday, 10-2, wrote the super, his letters big and authoritative and slowly sloping because the board against which he leaned when he wrote notices had a curve. Please use stairs during maintenance. The county had posted a fire safety compliance check for the building next week. The water authority slid an announcement about scheduled drops in water pressure that read like a prayer in a language no one in the building had learned. The bulletin board had several layers of tape under some corners and a bubble where the masonite swelled when it rained a certain way. The stairwell door had a new note, no entry 10-2, electrical testing. It wasn't clear whether electrical testing made stairwells illegal or whether the super had wished them so. He stared at the paper as if it would explain itself. The fluorescent light above him buzzed angry, then subsided to its usual waspish complaint. He blinked, his eyes full of a pressure he couldn't place, and turned back to the elevator because the day wanted its tokens paid on time. He did not push the new button. He did not look at it. The elevator delivered him monogamously to 1. He told himself that everything in the world remains stubbornly some form of itself until a person decides to let it be otherwise. He walked under the awning and through the white that no longer felt clean, and he made it to the corner without watching the traffic light because he was fearful that if he counted red, yellow, green, it would count back. He told himself to quit taking the car at midday up 1 floor because the stairwell had the yellow ribbon. He told himself to keep his head down and his feet straight. He told himself to leave the towel crooked. He straightened it. He woke to the refrigerator silent at 3:17 and thought of a man he once saw on the highway standing by his blown tire, hands on his hips looking at a flat rubber circle with such energy that the tire must have felt embarrassed. He waited and waited. The click came, second by second later than it should have. He forced himself to go to the window, to lay the edge of the blinds between two fingers and look at the traffic light and count the red, the yellow, and the green. The yellow held once too long, and he shook his head like a person being told a story that is not quite about him. He sat quietly on his couch like he was a guest in his own living room. The morning of the inspection, he made a point of getting up early. The building had been kind enough to underestimate him before. He showered, dressed, checked the towel twice, and then deliberately hung it crooked, a half-inch too high, then waited to see if he could stand it. He put on his coat and went into the hallway and found the elevator door open with the orange cones in front of it. A cartoon arrangement of safety. Two men with tool belts stood by the motor cabinet. The older one with silver hair combed bravely, the younger one with a hard plastic clipboard. They nodded to him. He nodded back. "Stairs only," the older one said, respectful to his lie of authority. He went to the stairwell door, confronted the printed warning, thought about ignoring it, decided he did not want to test the sort of magic involved in tempting electricity when someone had thought to call it by its government name, and turned back into the hallway to wait. The elevator men muttered about load, about drift, about the service relay, about how the building had clearly been modernized by someone's cousin, and he felt fondness for them, the way you can feel fondness for men who still name objects like they are animals. The fluorescent light buzzed alive, brighter, the hum more certain. A siren somewhere far away remembered to be heard. He leaned against the wall and watched his life not respectfully. By mid-morning, the inspection had found nothing that could explain an uninvited 8. The younger man asked the older whether the extra button was some kind of prank. The older said if it was, it would be one he understood. Wire the door open, skip the floors like you're on a service run, fun, funny, and meant for building a legend to tell over coffee. The younger man crouched and traced the wires and shook his head. No new wire. The buttons were stock. The panel was old, but honest. The elevator was a decent machine. "Power surge," the older suggested. Panel saw a voice it didn't mean to hear. "Happens with the older types. They hold ghosts in them. The codes, I mean." He looked apologetic for having said the word ghosts. David nodded as if he'd been told news about rain. The older man brushed dirt off his hands into his palms and quickly brushed his palms together so as not to let the dirt fall on the building he didn't own. The doors were released to use. David used them. The elevator delivered him docilely to the first floor, then the 7th, then the 2nd, when he misremembered his destination because he was not who he thought he was. The 8 did not show. He felt his lungs understand their job again. He poured cereal into a bowl like the littlest priest of a forgettable church. He sat and ate and listened to the refrigerator hum and the traffic light do its performance, and the stairwell light come on and off as men in jackets and women in shoes walked their mornings into place. 3 days passed and nothing happened. No dirt hallways, no politely glowing 8s. The towel stayed where he placed it. The fridge clicked and hummed on cue. The barcode scanner at the market chirped its progress into him. Connie handed him his change with cold fingers and a glance out the window at the sky that suggested a weather she and he might not have in common because her mother lived outside the city and perhaps the sky was different there. He slept, which is not to say well, but to say he was not an enemy to his own body for a night or two. On the 4th day, a receipt appeared under his mug that he had not placed there. He had been out, he had come home to a clean kitchen because he left it that way, and he had set his keys on the counter in the spot where the laminate has a nick shaped like a continent. He had walked into the bathroom, made sure the towel was aligned, washed his hands twice, and gone back to the kitchen for a glass of water. He lifted his mug by habit, intending to slide the receipt away and use the dry space it had kept safe, and the receipt that slid out was not his. It had his hardware store's header, but listed items he had not purchased. 3 lengths of sisal rope, a box of masonry nails, a bundle of cedar shims. The timestamp was midday, when he'd been at his desk composing an email to a contractor about a permit he knew he would never obtain. He told himself he had put it there 2 weeks ago and not noticed. He tried to think where he might have bought rope. Nothing came. The refrigerator hummed, steady, not really caring about rope or the receipts that claimed such things were purchased. He folded the receipt and placed it under the magnet on the side of the fridge, because a receipt wants to be held, and at least he could give it that. On the 5th day, the stairwell light died between 2 and 3, and he had to climb in a darkness that made him think of the hallway with the dirt. His breath climbed out of him in little puffs. His fingers found the rail and discovered it was sticky with some resin he could not name, except to say that it had the feeling of tree sap and also the feeling of someone having been careless with their morning. He wiped his hands on his jeans, hating the stain before he could see it. On the 6th day, a notice went up. Elevator outage 4 to 4:30 for routine update. He smiled at it, affectionately, because updates always tell you what they wanted to be when they were younger. He planned to slip home around 4. He came a little early, the way some men come early to tests, and found the elevator doors open and the cones discarded, the panels insides exposed like an old man's chest. He took the stairs. The stairwell light buzzed, and then held, and he felt it had done a good job, even though it was only a light. On the 7th day, he let the elevator find him. He pressed 1. He watched 7 and 6 and 5, and none of those numbers caused panic in him, which felt like a victory. At 4, the hum changed. He knew it now, the way fever knows which body to choose. At 2, the panel's segues between news of the world made a small stutter. At the little green one, the 8 lit with courtesy. The doors opened onto the dirt. He stood. His breath stayed with him for now. The hall reached out, the kind of reaching things do when someone pretends to leave. He looked down at the floor of the unknown, the dirt packed by feet with no weight, the scuffs that could be drags or a broom done poorly. The walls had gone from unformed to true. The bricks were there, old, rough, with mortar pushed too far out from the joints, so the wall had a texture like 1,000 tiny decisions. He saw now the number 8 on the wall near the elevator door. The door frame there was not the one from his building. It was a frame that had become a frame because someone had insisted without tools. The number was like a notation in a music he could not hear. He stepped forward. It wasn't brave and it wasn't stupid. It was a body setting the time. He stepped and the dirt held him. The elevator behind him breathed its low metal breaths and then held its breath like a person waiting for someone to say goodnight. He took 3 steps into the hall. He reached his hand out and touched the wall. It was so cold his fingers burned. Moisture had condensed on the face of some of the bricks and then dried, leaving little pale lines like the salt tide leaves behind on a pier. He pressed his palm to a brick and felt a vibration, not from inside the wall, but from inside himself, traveling out into it like he was the instrument, and it was to be tuned. He let his hand drop. He walked, careful, his feet making the sound of a living person in a place that did not remember living. The hall turned after 10 paces. He turned with it. There was a door. It was not a door to any apartment he knew in his building. It was a wood panel, the kind of fake wood they used in cheap conversions in the 70s, without a knob, but with a black smudge at hand height where hands had been. He didn't knock. He didn't want to test how much his own habits were governing the day. He stood close enough to read the grain, and the grain shifted, the pattern of the fake printed knot seeming to shiver under his regard. He backed away and bumped into a second door, one that had been invisible to him, flush with the wall, the seam visible only where dust had failed to wrap itself around something that had been moved long ago. He turned back to the elevator. It was there. It had not left. He walked toward it like a person walking toward the end of a phrase. He reached the threshold, and the car made itself small in its recess. The light inside the car making a tiny theater of a space that had been faithful to him. He stepped inside. He pressed 7, not 1, because he had to go upstairs and not down. The doors closed. The car did what cars do when asked politely to rise. When the doors opened on his hallway, the beige carpet looked like a blessing. The seashell pictures were a comfort, their frames cheap and steady. He went to his door and put the key in and found a slickness on the metal that made him wipe his hand on his jeans before he dared turn. Inside, he stood and listened to the refrigerator. It clicked on 1 second earlier than it usually did. He smiled, then stopped smiling because it had been an assumption to mark anything as usual. He opened his cupboard to get a glass and found his set of mugs rearranged. The chipped one with the blue rim had moved to the left. The plain white one had moved to the right. He had no memory of doing that. He realigned them with the care of a man who thinks alignment is a way to repay a debt. He did not tell anyone at work. He did not tell Connie at the corner store. He did not call the super because the super had opinions about the modernized system and would say, "You press the wrong buttons, you punch them too hard, you people." He did not tell his sister because she would hear what he was saying as an attempt to mend a year that had gotten out from under itself, and she would remind him that he had left before that year and after, and she would be kind, and he could not handle kindness. On the 8th day, he brought a flashlight. He walked into the elevator like someone pretending the best. He pressed 1. He watched 7 become 6, 5, 4. He ran his thumb along the groove where they keep the metal panel and felt the dust collected there because dust likes to store itself in grooves. The elevator moved past 1. 8 lit. The door opened. He turned on the flashlight, but the beam dribbled in the air like light underwater. It did not penetrate nicely. It only made the foreground bright and embarrassed the rest. The hall looked back without eyes. He walked out, stopped, waited to see if his feet would register on the dirt like a hand in flour. They did. He put his hand out and let the beam find the ceiling. It was low, it was almost domestic. The plaster up there had bulges and shadows where the laths beneath had done what old laths do. Breathed, shifted, let their nails find new opinions. He heard a soft hum that may have been the sound of his own blood and may have been something humming somewhere far away and may have been the refrigerator wanting him back. He walked to the place where the hall turned and paused at the door with the fake wood grain. He raised the flashlight and the beam took on a texture like he was shining into smoke. He took a rapid breath and stood perfectly still so he could decide whether he would make a second. He did. A skittering sound came from behind him, small and careful. He turned and saw nothing. He turned back, and the second door, the flush one, had a seam slightly more visible, like someone had pushed from within. He stepped back. He felt the elevator behind him like a place on a map that would cease to exist if he thought about it incorrectly. He let himself think about his towel, his mug, his receipts, his refrigerator click. He let those 4 little anchors hold him. He turned his back on the doors and walked toward the car. He did not hurry. He pressed 7. He watched the doors come together. He watched the 8 wink out like something that had said its line and gone off stage. For a while, the 8th floor kept to its manners. It came in a pattern he could not chart. 3 days without, then 2 days with. Morning, yes, evening, no. 2 nights when it offered him 8. And he refused it by pressing 7 again. And the car, like a dog, just did what he asked. He slept little. He left receipts under his mug, a little fanned archive of proof that his days were not entirely invented. He folded his towel on purpose in a way he did not like, so he could fix it afterward. He discovered he could not work with the refrigerator silent, and he could not work when it hummed too loud. Either condition made him stand in the doorway of his kitchen with grief for no one. His body took on small wearing habits. He chewed the inside of his lip until the taste of iron arrived, and he thought he might have cut something that would not stop. He woke with a film on his tongue, not sour, not sweet, something like the smell of a plastic toy left on a radiator too long. He fell asleep at his desk one afternoon with his head in his hand and woke to a red mark on his palm where a seam of the desk had made a decision about his skin. He ate badly. He drank too much water and then too little. He avoided the gym because the gym had mirrors, and mirrors told men stories they deserved, only when the world was not busy whispering a cold, damp thing about a hallway with dirt. The building posted a new notice: parking lot closed, sinkhole repair. He stared at the word sinkhole the way a person stares at an unflattering photograph of themselves. The super taped the paper crooked. The thumbtack holding the left corner was the wrong color. Another notice said water shut off Saturday, 2:06 p.m., and he set an alarm for 1:30 and filled his bathtub, because he had inherited that habit from a woman who had grown up with storms. The stairwell light buzz went higher in pitch the day the plumber showed up to check the boiler and did not go back until long after the plumber had left with a message about parts on order that worked like a lullaby for no one. The corner store barcode scanner fell into a pattern of double beeps that threw him off enough that he found himself lingering at the counter after his purchase, trying to remember the single beep from when the world had felt like a single beep. Connie wiped the counter and said quietly, "People are forgetting their change." He lifted the coins she had pushed toward him and set them in the little dish by his front door and found them too warm the next morning when his fingers went to get bus fare. On the 19th day, the elevator took him to 8 with a little flourish, as if it had been trained to have flair. He swallowed, the swallow feeling like a decision he would have to account for later. He stepped out. The hall held its breath like it always did. He walked to the turn and stopped by the doors and saw something new, a small crescent of damp on the dirt, the shape of a person's heel. It glistened the way damp does before it becomes a spot, then dried as he stared. He was no longer sure he was being watched. He was sure the watching had been done, and the watching was ready to be something else. He stepped toward the flush door and put his ear to it. It was colder than the wall. His ear collected a tone. It could have been his own blood. It could have been the building's life, some apartment fan, some coil in some air cycler, some motor far away. He stepped back and lifted his hand to find a seam. He pressed into the seam and felt a give, like cardboard under a wet label. The door moved a hair. He withdrew his fingers as if the door had been a mouth. He turned off his flashlight before he got back into the elevator because he wanted to show the inside of that small car, that he trusted it. The car was sufficient to itself. It took him to 7 and he went into his apartment and the towel hung wrong and he did not fix it because somewhere a hand had pushed a door an inch. In the night, a noise came. He sat up without thinking, his hand already halfway to the counter where the flashlight lay, and then stopped because he had promised himself he would not be the man who must always reach for a thing that illuminates part of the problem and none of the answers. The noise had the shape of the scraping he had first heard. If the scraping had been studied for the test and made more polite, he sat and listened to it go away, then return. He waited to see if the refrigerator would help by clicking. It did. He lay down again and did not sleep, and counted the red, yellow, green he could not see. On the 21st day, a neighbor disappeared. Not disappeared in the tragic sense. Disappeared into silence. Mrs. Pike on 7B, who had a ceramic duck by her door that changed hats with the seasons, did not open the door for the mailman. There was a notice on her doorknob, folded paper like an apology. The duck had a bare head. It looked like the morning after a party. The super muttered about relatives and then stopped muttering because relatives were not the kind of magic a super is strong in. The stairwell light hummed and then cut out when someone down on 5 slammed a door. The hum resumed as if someone pleaded with it and it granted mercy. He pressed 1. The elevator delivered him to 8. He did not press 7 to cheat. He did not press any other button. He went into the dirt hall, and he walked as though he were walking into the ocean, hoping the water would take him where it takes a person who loves the shore. At the door with fake wood, he found that if he stood directly in front of it and breathed, the printed knot in the fake grain would seem to rotate slowly like a planet in a children's show. He raised his hand and knocked because it had come to that. 3 knuckles, a sound like a question asked in a library. There was an answer, not another knock, not a word, not a sound a person makes with their organs and muscles and breath. A small exhale from the seam of the other door, like someone set a mouse down gently right behind it. He took a half step to his right, putting his body in the geometry of the wall and the door and the place the unknown would stand if the unknown were making diagrams. He held his hands up, palms open, because some part of his body thought this would placate someone who loved polite gestures. The seam in the flush door widened. He watched it, forgetting his chest had a job, watched it widen to 1 inch, then 2. A smell came out, dust that had tried to be perfume a long time ago, the faintest electrical burn. Something moved behind the seam, a trick of light, a trick of his own sense of edges. He swayed. He let himself sway. The seam widened to 3 inches. He saw dark beyond. If you could call it dark. He saw the idea of a space beyond dark. He stepped back. 1, 2, the kind of steps you take when your body reminds you you did not agree to be born for this. The seam stopped widening. The door stood and waited, ajar the way a mouth opens when the tongue searches for a word. He went to the elevator. He did not hurry. He stood inside the car and pressed 7 and pinned his arms to his sides because he did not want to lift his hands to look at them and find that they belonged to someone else. In his apartment, the towel on the oven was an accusation. He fixed it and then put it wrong, back and forth, muscle memory asserting itself against a new need. He took his mug off the counter and held it with both hands, like it was a bird. He looked out the window at the traffic light, and the traffic light, because it is a moral creature, did what it had been told. The next afternoon there was a water advisory, not a shut-off, not a boil, but a gentle note from the water authority about pressure fluctuation and mineral content, and a small square map with his building inside a circle the color of caution tape. The corner store posted a sign asking people not to purchase more than 2 gallons of water at a time, and he obeyed, even though he had a thought like a thief's about slipping a third under his coat. The barcode scanner double beeped like a heart that had learned a dance. He stood on the sidewalk and watched a repair crew 3 blocks down cut an oval of asphalt away from the road with a saw that screamed like a dissatisfied god. The men in their coats had a language they used with their hands that made him want to go home and count his towels. On the 24th day, the elevator looked tired. It had no new button. It had no old one. The 8 did not appear, but the 1 blinked like an eyelid so slow he wondered if it would ever open. He pressed 7, and the car complied cheerfully, as if grateful to be doing an uncomplicated job for once. At home, he found a small oval pressed into the carpet at the threshold of his kitchen. If you placed your foot there, it might be his heel. It might be someone else's heel. He stepped around it because he is not a man who desecrates reminders. He ran the tap and filled his kettle and turned it on, and the switch thing inside made that small click like it was killing a fly. The refrigerator hummed, slower. He placed his hand on the cold side of it, the way you might lay your hand on a horse to persuade it of love. The hum rose a quarter tone, as if the refrigerator had been heartened by being touched, and he blinked hard at the fact it had not done that for anyone else. He set his mug under the stream of boiling water and watched the steam go up and out. The condensation on the window made little trails as it collected and ran, and when one reached the sash, he saw, in the track it left behind, a shape, a six-armed star. Not a perfect snowflake, a child's version of one, drawn by a teacher whose patience had been borrowed. It melted away with a sensible speed. He did not touch the glass to check if the shape held. He took his mug to the couch and held it under his face, and took in the steam like a man held in a coat until he remembers his name again. He stopped taking the stairs for a while because the stairwell light had developed a fight with itself. It had begun to turn off exactly when the door closed, the pressure of the door making it think its job was to rest. He didn't want to stand in the dark between floors and hear the building teach him that there is more than one way to be inside. He used the elevator and the elevator behaved, except when it didn't. And when it didn't, he used his manners and left. On a Saturday, he wasn't ready. The 8 lit at a time of day it had never been willing to perform. He had his scarf in his hand and his keys in his teeth because he was taking down trash to the bins before the super lost his temper again. The doors opened onto the dirt. The light in the elevator made a small yellow circle on the floor outside the threshold, a little stage none of them had learned to play. He set the bag of trash down in the car because he could not face it in the dirt hall and walked out with his bare hands as if he didn't have bones. At the fake wood door, he did not knock. He pressed his palm to it. It was colder. It was not wood, not even the pretense. It was a laminate over something that had decided not to be what it had been asked to be. He pushed, and the door moved, not like a door, not on hinges. It moved like the flush door had moved, weak at the seam first, yielding to shame. The little room inside was a room you could live in if your entire life had been a bad memory of a room. The floor was dirt, but tamped. The walls were a foam under the laminate and had dings in them where someone's chair had left its bite. A bulb hung from a wire and pretended not to be afraid of itself. There was no furniture. He stood in the doorway and the air moved over his neck. He thought of his towel and his mug and his refrigerator and the receipts under the magnet and the traffic light and the stairwell light and the barcode beep. He thought of all the small ways he had proven he was a grateful tenant. He thought of the noise the elevator makes when you ask it to close. He stepped inside. He was very careful. He put his hands in his pockets because his hands needed somewhere to be. The room felt like the echo of his own kitchen on a winter morning in a city that could not afford to be wrong. He looked at the far wall. It had a shape in it, a slightly lighter rectangle where a picture might have hung for a very long time. He took a step toward it. The dirt under his foot found his weight like a friend. He took another step. The rectangle grew clearer. The texture of laminate was worn there, a subtle sheen where fingers had touched for years without meaning to. He lifted his hand and then decided not to touch a thing that had loved someone else. A sound came from behind him, a heel, a drag. It had the weight of a person who had agreed to live with pain. He turned. He had thought he would see a hand come into view, or something else, something smiling. The doorway was empty. The hall beyond lay its long strip of quiet in front of him. He waited without breathing until the noise rotated itself into a silence he could see. "Goodbye," he said, because the only way to survive being ridiculous is to overperform it. He left the room, and the door found its seam again. It grudged closed. He went to the elevator with his scarf in his hand and his keys in his pocket and his head a vacant lot. He retrieved his trash and took it out and did not look at his neighbors because psychologies operate across languages. On the 31st day, the super held a meeting in the lobby about the water shutoff that would be prolonged because the valve had been found to be of a size that no one kept in the city any longer. The crowd of tenants, blue coats, bagged hair, toddlers in shoes with lights, stood in a shape suggesting trust while their mouths suggested the opposite. He stood at the back by the stove of the old radiator and listened and looked at the elevator door. The elevator door looked like it didn't feel well. He raised his hand and aborted it at his temple like an individual of insufficient humor. He went home. He ran his tap to fill his pot because he would not be told how to celebrate the end of a day, and the water stuttered and spit and then came and was brown and then was clear. He filled his pot and set it on the stove, and the flame took, and he listened to it. A siren far away soared through whatever the night had intended, the pitch rising and falling like a bad idea. He ate soup standing at the counter. He set his spoon down and watched it move, not by itself, by him. He had set it on the receipt under his mug, and the soft paper, damp with its task, had allowed the spoon to slide a centimeter, as if a gesture had been completed. He picked up the spoon and put it back. He picked it up again and put it at a right angle and looked at it, and it did not move. He breathed out and silently asked the refrigerator to help. In the quiet after midnight, he heard it again. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It was not only a scrape, it was the sound wooden things make when they are very old and move over one another. He lay in bed and counted the red, yellow, green that he could not see, counted the seconds between refrigerator clicks, counted the seconds the stairwell light stayed on across the hall when someone beat a soft path to the laundry room and back. He fell asleep at 3:13 and woke at 3:31 and fell asleep again at 4:07, and each time he re-entered his body, it felt as if someone else had been using it. On the 33rd day, he waited until nighttime, and then he wrote on a paper with a pencil, in very neat letters, "What is this?" He folded the paper once, then again, and put it in his pocket. He went to the elevator and let it take him where it liked. The doors opened, and he walked into the dirt, and he walked to the door, and he slid the paper into the seam of the lamination and stepped back. He stood with his arms folded, because that is what men do when they are not sure whether they have undertaken a foolish honor task. He waited. There was no sound. Then there was a sound so small he would have missed it if the refrigerator had tried to be helpful. It was paper being moved through dust. It was paper being accepted. He waited. He counted his breath. He did not count the light at Harron and Maury. The paper did not return. He laughed then, once, because laughter is an organ. The next morning, a paper lay on the floor by his door. He stepped on it with his bare foot, and the feel of the paper living under him made him recoil as if he had set his foot in something wet. He lifted the paper. It had no crease. It had not been folded as he had folded it. The letters on it were not his. They had his meticulousness without his cheerful ugliness. The paper said, "Welcome home." He sat on his couch and he placed the paper on the table, and he did not lift it again. He drank water and it had a taste like coppery wind. He had to go to work, but he didn't go. He called in and said in one syllable what men who run machines like to hear, "Sick." He hung up, which made him feel a grace he did not deserve. He took the towel from the oven door and rolled it and sat with it in his lap like a promising patient. He put his mug in the middle of the table without a receipt under it because he wanted to see if rings could be taught to behave in a more honest way. The mug left its circle, and the circle looked like a record of a plan. He went to the elevator. He pressed 1. The car delivered him without complaint to 8. He stepped out. He went straight to the door and he pressed his palm to it and he whispered, "I don't want this." The door made a noise like a shrug. He pushed. The door opened the way a curtain opens when a room breathes. Inside, the room had changed. It had his refrigerator, or the idea of it. The hum existed in the center of the room like a skin. His towel hung from a rod that did not attach to any wall. His mug sat on a table, and the table had a ring, and the ring had the exact size of his mug's ring. He stood, and the room did not blush at the theft. He took a step forward. The ring on the table grew wet, then dried, as if someone had breathed on it with love. The dragging sound came from farther down the hall. Even that sound had grown affectionate. He thought of the hand. He thought of the seam on the flush door. He thought of the super's cones, the county's advisories, the barcode scanner's double note, the stairwell light's small illness. The traffic light, pausing on yellow, as if deciding the receipts under the magnet, the oval pressed into his carpet at the threshold where a heel had preferred to live. He thought of a message that said, "Welcome home," in a tidy hand that had learned to make letters with caution. He put his own hand on the edge of his own refrigerator that was not his, in the room that had found ways to love him, and for a moment, he felt the same click. The room whispered an apology. He whispered acceptance. He left the room. The door closed with a politeness he had envied in men once. The hall smelled like damp, and the faint, kept-under perfume of old things. He went to the elevator because he had to, because you cannot live in a room that looks like your kitchen unless the room is your kitchen. The car carried him up to 7. The seashell pictures hung at the same height. The carpet welcomed and complained. The oval remained in the threshold. He stepped around it because he understands how to pay respect. He slept that night in his bed like a person practicing. He woke to the refrigerator's click. He cried like a man who was trying not to fight the sky. He folded the towel and hung it. He pressed the receipts flat. He looked out at Harron and Maury and counted the red and yellow and green, and the number never came out even, and he did not punish the arithmetic. He would, in the days that followed, step into the elevator and let it deliver him to the 8 more easily than to 1. Sometimes he would walk into the room and stand with his hand on the refrigerator, and it would hum, and he felt for a house, very seen. Sometimes the door would not open, and he would be sent back to his real kitchen with the small pleasure of fixing his towel and the small honesty of moving his mug to catch the rings he should care about. He learned when the stairwell light would take that one lost breath, and he learned how to stand in the dark and let his eyes be a creature. He learned that Connie S. double beep meant nothing and everything, and he learned to count the pauses between yellow and red, and write them down on the back of his receipts, as if the city had chosen to speak a code, and he had been chosen to be kind. On the day the building manager posted the note about extermination, mice in the walls, please tape your cabinet doors, he stood in his apartment and listened to sounds and did not hear mice. Not mice the way cities have taught him to, but something else. Tapping, measured. As if a person a hallway over were hanging a frame by closing their eye and counting from a place within. He lay on the floor and put his ear to carpet and felt, not thought, a rhythm. He thought for a moment of calling the super and saying a sentence that would begin with "I know I am not," but he did not call because he had learned that the world was doing him a favor by letting him be included. An ending would put you where you think you want to be. He did not get one. He got a life. It felt like standing in the doorway and listening for the refrigerator and counting 3 heartbeats more than you should have to, and then hearing it. It felt like folding a towel wrong so that you may put it right. It felt like keeping receipts under a magnet and refusing to throw them away because the edge curls in a way that tells you the day had a curve. It felt like watching the traffic light and telling yourself that if it holds on yellow a moment longer than usual, you will take that as permission to stand in the hallway and breathe. It felt like stepping into the elevator, watching 7 become 6 and 5 and 4, and then pressing your palm against the brass panel and waiting with the ridiculous, most human hope that a car with a heart will take you exactly where you need to be told to go. He is alive, or alive enough to be inside his apartment and inside the other room and inside the hall with its dirt and its door and the dragging sound that you learn to recognize as your own. The elevator still offers him 8 some days. He shakes his head and says no, as gently as a machine can be told, and presses 7, and comes home and straightens a towel and presses his palm to a refrigerator and counts the sequence of lights at Harren and Maury and folds a receipt to keep a ring from staining a counter that has held a decade of meals that were almost a reason. And on nights when the refrigerator refuses, and the light at Harren and Maury miscounts, and the stairwell goes dark, and the barcode scanner barks where it used to sing, he has the little room waiting. He has a handprint on dirt, oval and true. He has the note in its tidy letters. He has a door that will open, not with kindness and not with mercy, but with a correctness that resembles love. He has a place to set his mug down, and he has made peace with the stain it leaves. He belongs, simply and terribly, in both places. And when the elevator opens onto a dark and gives him the smell of damp, and the patient 30 feet of hallway, and the number 8 scratched into a plaster that wants to learn to be permanent. He thinks as a person who has finally learned where to put his hand, I'm exactly where I am supposed to be. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.